Retracted S, you've heard about it. Now we're going to go in depth to explain exactly what the retracted S is, why it's so important to Latin and ancient Greek. I'm Luke, this is Raph, and this is polýMATHY. So Raph, thanks to you, years ago, you clued me into the fact that Latin and ancient Greek must have the sound of retracted S. So to demonstrate it, hopefully it's reasonably audible in here, but it's the difference between a normal English S sound, or most English speakers' S sound, which is S, or instead, the retracted S is going to be like this. S, and Raph, yeah, okay, so this is the guy who taught me, and he's much better at this than I am, so...
Oh, you do it wonderfully. That's exactly right.
Took me a while. Practically speaking, you just move the tip of the tongue a little bit higher. Instead of, what I do is I bring it behind my front incisors instead of leaving it relaxed under the lower incisors. And that's why I do it. So what more, can you give more detail about what the retracted S really is?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly the most helpful way to think about it, if you speak a language like English or Italian that has both the sound S as in sing, or sh like the SH sound in English, the best way to think about it is that this sound is almost directly between those two. So it's not s and it's not sh, but it's sh, sh. And you can sort of either move forward from the sh sound or move backwards from the s sound, and you'll basically get there with a little bit of practice.
Yeah, the way I think about it too is pitch based. There's many aspects that go on to the sounds we make, but a lot of them are pitch related. So for example, like you taught me, sounds can get confused if their pitches are similar enough. So the s is high and then the sh is low. That's not the only difference, but it is a very clear difference to me. And that's so if you do it like a spectrum, going from sh, and I think people can intuitively figure out how to do that to get in between somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
And so so if you are a speaker of one of the many languages that uses the sound, then this is nothing new for you. So if you are a speaker of European Spanish, or of Icelandic, Dutch, Modern Greek, Sardinian maybe, what are some other languages that we could mention? Icelandic.
Finnish. Other modern languages. Yeah, I think that's the panoply, right?
The ones that, the ones that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Some varieties of Italian also, like in, some speakers from around Bologna might have the sound.
Yeah, depending on how they've done the merger, right?
Exactly, depending on how they've done it.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the importance of this sound, I mean, of course, I think, this is not a necessary thing to get in order to, speak a language like Latin or ancient Greek well and be understood. And
why is it not necessary?
Well, because there's only one sibilant sound. As in, if someone says, so for instance, if I take the example of I don't know what's a word in Latin,
tempus.
Tempus. If I say tempus, it's completely understandable.
Yeah.
It's clearly meant to be the same sound.
Right.
And so, there's only one of these sibilant sounds, right? So these sorts of sounds that we're talking about, these are sibilants.
Well, what about modern Greek though? Because it has it too. Is it more important to?
So if you were to speak modern Greek and you were to say aftos instead of aftos, or if you were to speak, Peninsular Spanish and you say nosotros instead of nosotros, then you don't sound like a person from that place or a person from that country or a speaker of that variety. You're still perfectly understandable. And so, this is really an exercise for people who are super into the level of detail that we can get to in figuring out what did these languages actually sound like when they were being spoken. Right. And so it may sound absolutely crazy to some of you that we can be so certain about the precise realization of a sound.
But we can be.
An ancient language, but this is one of those examples where we can really be extremely certain about how this sound was produced for many, many, many speakers at the very least.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. All right. So we talked about, so we know what the retracted S is. It's the sound S instead of S. Right. You mentioned some languages that have it. Do we want to mention some words in those languages?
Well, I mean, I guess we can mention that in the context of some of the evidence for why we know that this was the sound that was used in Latin and also in ancient Greek. So one principle is the notion of sounds being sufficiently distinct from one another in order to be easily distinguished. So in a language like English, where we have these two sibilant sounds, s and sh, it's important in order to distinguish these sounds that they sound very different from one another. And so if the English S was more retracted, if it was closer to the sh sound, it would be harder to distinguish in speech.
Right.
And so for that reason, in the history of English, it seems to have occurred that S was pushed forwards after we developed this sh sound. Because in reality, not only are we saying that this was the sound of the S in classical Latin and classical Greek, but it seems quite likely that this was the way S was realized going all the way back to Proto-Indo-European, the common ancestor of all of these languages and of the vast majority of the languages spoken in Europe today.
And going in between Proto-Indo-European and modern English, where we have a sh, like she or shall, older varieties of English before the sh developed and even into Proto-Germanic, right?
Right, exactly. So we observe sound shifts such that, for instance, in English, we have the word ship, which is a Germanic word, and in Icelandic, it's skip, right? So you have a ska, whereas in English, you have sha.
Hence the skipper, the shipper, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Proto-Indo-European is reconstructed with only one sibilant sound, just one S, which can very comfortably sort of sit in between the s and the sh of English, because it just has all of that space that a sibilant could exist in to fill up. Whereas in later stages, in different branches, we see other sibilants being developed through regular sound shifts like paltalization.
Oh, sibilant. Let's talk about what a sibilant is. What is a sibilant?
Right, so a sibilant is just one of these sounds like s, sh, s, etc. Those are all sibilants.
So I guess we could say there are 3 voiced and 3 voiceless, right? So at least, I mean, there's other varieties
that are relevant for our.
Yeah.
I mean, you could also.
Right, you gotta be more retroflex, further retracted, or I know Croatian has a super high pitched.
Very fronted one.
So basically that's sort of our generalization here, that the retracted S is between what we think of as sh like she and s like si. So there'd be sh, j, sa, z, sa, z. And English only has the first 2 and the last 2 of those 6.
Exactly.
Okay. Those are sibilants. I mean, they're kind of fricative?
Yeah, it's a kind of fricative.
Okay.
Exactly. Sibilant is kind of fricative.
Yeah.
What we observe looking at the breadth of the Indo-European languages is that across different branches, every time we observe a language that hasn't developed additional sibilants, we observe this retracted S sound. So for instance, in the Germanic languages, we have languages like Icelandic, which is North Germanic, which has never developed a sh sound. So as we saw with the word skip, right, it's retained these ska clusters. Or another example would be, in English we have fish, and in Icelandic you have fiskus, I believe, which is like biskis in Latin, fiskus. And so because it's never developed this sh sound, it's just retained that original S phoneme all the way from Proto-Indo-European to modern Icelandic. And the sound we have in Icelandic is this slightly retracted sound. So if you listen to fiskur or hestur, right, you'll hear this retracted sound. Another example is Dutch. That's a West Germanic language. It's a different branch of Germanic. It's closer to English than Icelandic.
Yeah, skol, right?
Right,
Skol.
exactly. Would be.
Sorry, Dutch speakers, I haven't spoken Dutch in a while. Skol, for school.
Exactly, yeah.
Which in German is Schule.
And so Dutch has actually developed a sound that's similar to the English SH sound.
Yeah.
But it's not identical.
SJ, I think.
It's yeah, exactly. So it's created from a coalescence of s and ya originally. So it's more like sha, sort of like a Japanese sha sound.
Interesting.
And so sha is sufficiently distinct from sa that those 2 sounds can be distinct, more so than sha in English. would be from s. So even though Dutch has developed another sibilant, it's even further back. It's not quite in this zone of sibilants that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't interfere with the inherited s sound.
Nice.
And if you ever listen to a Dutch speaker in English, you'll often hear this sound for English S. They'll use this retracted S sound. It's a very typical feature of a Dutch accent in English and an Icelandic accent.
Yeah.
And a Greek accent. So another example would be standard modern Greek. We have words like aftos, right?
Aftos.
Or skilos.
Skilos.
And this is really interesting because Greek is another example where we have other varieties of Greek. You can either call them dialects. They're usually referred to as dialects, although sometimes they're not fully mutually intelligible with standard modern Greek. For instance, in
Pontic.
well, so Cypriot Greek.
Oh yeah.
Skilos, right?
Skilos.
Dog is shilos.
Shilos.
So the ska has paltalized before a front vowel, before e, into sha.
Just like Italian.
Exactly, just like Italian.
It's like would be a good scientia, classical Latin scientia. Actually, let me retract that as far as scientia. And then of course the ti becomes a palatalized affricate scientia, and eventually it becomes scientia, modern Italian scienza. So just like shilos, which is a non-retracted s in Cypriot. Shilos.
I'm pretty sure.
Right.
I'm not an expert on Cypriot Greek. If you have any Cypriots, tell us. Is your S distinct from standard Greek S?
Yeah.
But at the very least, modern Greek has one sibilant in terms of place, right? So there's also a voiced version z.
Like in say the island of Lesbos, which has the voiced lesb in front of the b. And I'm sorry, it's a frequent Lesbos. I'm sorry, I'm using the ancient pronunciation. Lesbos. Sorry, Greeks, please don't get mad.
They're already typing.
They often are. Polakis, eh?
So yeah, exactly. In modern Greek, all the way from Proto-Indo-European to modern Greek, at no point has there been a sound shift, it seems, that developed an additional sibilant sound.
It has the os of Proto-Indo-European.
Yeah, exactly. So likos, right?
Yeah.
Wolf in modern Greek is from wilkos in Proto-Indo-European. Wilkos. With a
kind of like equos.
Yeah, exactly.
Wilkos.
Which is of course also what lupus comes from.
Lupus.
And it's what wolf comes from.
Which is wolfaz. It's early to get to.
That's Proto-Germanic.
Are we getting into wolfaz?
Well, no, we'll get to the.
Okay,
we'll get to that later.
So excited! We're finally talking about retracted S.
Yeah, it's become a bit of a meme, so it's important to just say everything there is to say about it here. Sheesh. Now is the time of the S.
Now is the time of the S, of the retracted S.
Yes.
Okay.
So, yet another example, right? Greek is in a completely different branch of Indo-European from Germanic, and yet we see the same sound for the same S that's in the in cognate vocabulary, because in these languages that are very conservative, none of them have developed another sibilant sound. And within each branch, you can make contrasts, right? So English is a perfect example of a contrast in the Germanic languages where we've developed additional sibilants. And Italian would be the perfect example of a contrast in Romance, right? So in Italian, as we said, we've developed sh. Another example would be conoscere, right? Conoscere from conoscere. And of course, in the Romance languages, we have the language Sardinian, which never...
Don't forget Sardinian.
Which never palatalized the velar sound. So it never palatalized ka and ga before e. So we never get the chi-che sounds. So, for instance...
palatalization, which is, I've talked about before, you talked about it, but let's mention it anyway. Sometimes people think of palatalization as actually being the affricate. That's a little different. I mean, it's a palatalizing process, but I talked about, I think, in the letter C, letter G video in Latin pronunciation some months ago. But so letter C in front of a front vowel like E or E in classical language is ge, gi, as if it were a K or ka, ba in Italian. Just that's it. So ge, just like ge sound. Eventually, a palatalization process happens, meaning that the velar sound, so in the velum, which is the soft palate, so it goes from being ge, what we think of as a K sound, into a sound which we don't have in English, but which is present in modern Greek and Icelandic, yes? Okay. So it becomes ge, ge, ge. So it sounds a little bit like there's a Y sound in it, but it's not ge. It's not a Y sound that's on top of it. It resembles a Y sound because
the tongue is just a little bit more forward, basically, is what's happening.
Right, the contact point of articulation is more forward in the palate, and that's also where the Y sound is created in the word yes, which makes it sound like there's a Y sound in it.
Exactly.
Ge, ge,
Ge.
or the voiced version ge.
Right.
So these are what happen in Proto-Romance, or even actually certainly in some point in Imperial Roman Latin. Ge, ge, and based on Albanian. Right?
That's right. I mean, there's a whole bunch of. We could do a video on the viewers at some point as well.
We should, yeah.
That would be fun.
And then eventually moving forward, ge into either right into the affrigate, or there's another.
There's some different ways that it's hypothesized to have occurred in different branches of Romance, but the sort of common stage for most Romance languages is this kike stage, which then easily turns into chiche or tsitse, maybe from titye, right? Palatalized, like a palatal T sound.
Just like Cypriot Greek.
Right, exactly. So in Cypriot Greek we have chiche, just like Italian.
Shilos.
Shilos or ke and
che. Yeah, not crazy. Ke. So ancient, like Attic, classical, ancient Greek gai into Lucian pronunciation. So Roman classical imperial times gang, and then ge, the monophthongization, and finally ge is the modern Greek word as well, and then che in Cypriot.
In Cypriot Greek. Yeah. And so the reason why this is happening is because the vowels E and E are vowels that are pronounced at the very front of your mouth with your tongue far forward. And so sort of in anticipation of those vowels, when producing the consonant immediately preceding that vowel, there can be often in many languages a tendency to have that consonant be a bit further forward in anticipation. And so this is why we observe processes of palatalization occurring across languages. Over and over and over again. Right. Often you have multiple rounds of palatalization, centuries or millennia apart.
Like Romanian. Don't forget Romanian.
Right, Romanians had a couple rounds of palatalization. Sardinian is really interesting because from Latin gentum, right? In Sardinian you have gentu, no palatalization. It's not even kya, it's just gentu. And from skire, right, we have iskire, so they added an i at the beginning, but the ski is still ski. It's not even ski, right? There isn't even a little bit of palatalization there.
Skire.
Skire. Iskire.
Oh, sorry, iskire.
And then of course, like in Italian you have conoscere, in Sardinian you have conoscere. And so in Sardinian, we've never turned the ska into sha, and so sa, the S, is free to just stay exactly as it was, coming from Proto-Indo-European through Latin to Sardinian. So that's, we see Romance in one branch, we have this retention, we see it in Hellenic, in Greek, we see it in Germanic. Those are the branches that we've mentioned.
That's right.
Yes.
We're avoiding Celtic.
Exactly. We're avoiding, so Celtic, Slavic, those have very early processes of palatalization in many cases. And so those don't give us very good evidence because there's lots of sibilants that have developed at various points.
Yeah.
But then an illustration of this concept that we sort of neglected to mention earlier of taking up sort of the central point in the space that you have for sibilants. When you only have one sibilant would be finished. Right?
Finished.
So for instance, finished also has this s sound because it only has one sibilant. So yeah, kiitos. Thank you. So that's another example of this general principle that can also maybe be applied generally to Proto-Indo-European, in addition to the evidence we see from each of these branches. So, it also turns out that there's quite a bit of evidence that this sound was much more widespread historically in Europe than it is today. And so a really good illustration of this is Spanish. So most varieties of Spanish nowadays have an S, just like English. So if you listen to a Mexican Spanish speaker, they'll say todos, nosotros, right? However, if you listen to Peninsular Spanish, we have todos, nosotros, right? Spanish underwent paltalization, so it's interesting to see what happened in the case of Spanish. This is sort of one of my pet topics, and I always try to avoid ranting about it whenever we do videos where we touch upon
No, it's time to rant about it.
It's time to rant about it. So
you like rants, right? There's another rant.
Yeah, exactly. Here's a rant about the history of Spanish sibilants. Okay, so Spanish inherits S from Latin, which to this day in Peninsular Spanish is s, as in nosotros. It also developed two, not one, but two other sibilants at one point in its history. So in Old Spanish, first of all, we develop sh, as in gasha, box, which is from gapsa, I think. Gapsa. So that coalesces into a sh, gasha. Then you have casa, right, house. So there's a distinction between casa, house, and gasha, box.
And let me do it. So retracted casa.
Retracted casa.
And then
gasha. Like an SH sound.
So gasha, gasha, gasha.
Exactly.
Gasha.
And then you have another one, which is originally from an affricate tsa, tsa. So for instance, facere in Latin,
to do,
becomes facere in Old Spanish, in early Old Spanish. And in fact, Old Spanish also seems to have preserved a bilabial fricative F from like very Old Latin, facere. We can talk about that another time. But so facere, at some point this ts sound deaffricatizes, which means it loses the stop component. It just becomes a fricative s. And so at that point, you have three sibilants in Old Spanish as distinct phonemes. You have s, s, sh. And the s one, the middle one, the retracted S sound, is the one that's inherited from Latin S. And so to give an example of three words that are distinguished only by the sound, you have casa, which means he, she, it hunts.
Casa with the letter zeta.
Exactly, with the letter Z. So casa, which at one point would have been katza, or kadza, something like that. But it becomes casa. And then you have kasha, house. And then you have kasha, box. This is really interesting because the existence of these three sounds sort of keeps them in balance, but it's also a very unstable system because they're so close to each other, it's easy to get confused.
Especially with a very dynamic language and society like Spanish, where you already have varieties going on, a huge influence. It's part of the post.
And you have lots of non-native speakers also.
That's a big point. A lot of non-native speakers, unlike Basque, which has been able to retain all three.
Exactly. So Basque is an Iberian language. It's not Indo-European. And one of the most fascinating phonological features of Basque is that it's unclear if Basque developed this first or if Spanish developed this first, but clearly there was some influence between the two in terms of this system being set up in the first place, or really across all of Western Europe. But Basque to this day retains a three-way distinction between s, sh, sh. And Basque is a very small language. It's spoken by a community of speakers and by not that many non-native speakers, so it's mostly just maintained in the communities of native speakers that maintain the language. And so for this reason, it's easier for it to have maintained up until the present when it's become more standardized. It's been easier for it to retain this somewhat unstable system of three sibilants that are all very close to each other.
Super cool though.
Super cool.
Yeah.
So what happened in Spanish to get us to the modern situation? Well, if you know Spanish at all, you know that gasha, box, becomes gaja with a velar fricative.
Debuccalization.
Yes.
I learned the term from him, so I like it. Because the bucca, which is the vulgar Latin, we're going to make a vulgar Latin video, by the way. The informal Latin word, shall we say, for mouth, which replaces the word os, Latin word for mouth, such as where oralis is from os, oris, and so forth. So that's the word for mouth, right? But bucca would be a cheek, or even a cheek filled with food, bucca. So it could be a cheekful food, which is already in classical Latin, sort of an informal term for getting like a bite or a morsel of something would be a bucca. And then bucca ends up being the word which comes into Romance for word for mouth for a lot of it. So like bocca in Italian. And so to debuc, I don't know, I guess that's why it's debuccalized, because this is sort of the front part of the mouth where the bucca is. So hence debuccalized, going from sh to cha, right?
And losing its original place of articulation.
Yeah,
exactly.
Within the mouth, within what we consider the mouth, and into the I guess that's behind the tongue. Is that why is that sort of the line? I don't know what the line of debuccalization is.
Right.
The
pretty much.
I mean, make a DMZ joke, but I can't think of it. Debuccalized median zone.
Exactly. Yeah.
DMZ, debuccalized median. Right, keep going. So debuccalized.
Yeah.
Sh becomes cha.
So sh becomes cha. So
Yeah.
that's like of caja in modern Spanish. And then in peninsular Spanish, in sort of standard, that is northern peninsular Spanish, sa, the front S sound, which was originally a tsa, becomes tha.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of that. I thought there was a simultaneous switch. I wasn't aware, because Andalusia is where it's... Andalusia, sorry, wait, where's the accent on that word?
Andalusia.
Okay, got it right the first time. Andalusia. Well, it could be, I mean, they could have Thetheo, I guess. Yeah. But Andalusia is Caesar, Andalusia is where they have that. I thought it was just sort of at the same time branching away, but it's actually the older variant, you're saying.
Which?
The Ciceo.
Well, sort of. I mean, neither is older, right? So think about it this way. You have the three sounds. You have the three sounds, right? You have s, the front S, the retracted S, and sh. In all Spanish varieties, the sh sound debuccalizes. So in all Spanish varieties, you get caja, except for Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, but we won't go into that. Caja becomes caja. Then you have just these two S sounds. You have s and sh. You have s and s, right? So you have the fronted S and the retracted S. And then you have two options for what to do. And basically, northern Spain and southern Spain take two different routes. In northern Spain, in order to further differentiate them, just as how the sh sound was further differentiated by moving back in the mouth, they move the fronted S further forward. And that's how you get the th sound. That's very typical of standard European Spanish. So it has nothing to do with some Spanish king who couldn't pronounce the S.
Oh my God.
It doesn't make any sense.
That a king had a lisp and they imitated him.
Yeah, no, it's nonsense. This is why one would say gracias in modern standard peninsular Spanish.
Gracias.
Right? It's not gracias and it's not gracias. It's gracias, which was originally gracias, right? Two different S sounds.
Gracias.
Gracias. It's hard to distinguish.
Gracias.
Yeah.
I think I'm just going to speak Spanish that way now.
You'll
to go from, was it 1600s?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and say like Fernandez. Wait, Fernandez would be
beautiful. So in southern Spain, instead of pushing the fronted S forward, they push the retracted S forward and they merge the two. And so that's how you end up with just one sibilant, that is the fronted S, ceseo. And so that's how you get hacer or nosotros, casa, right, are the same as casa.
Right.
And then Latin America is mostly colonized from people leaving from southern Spain, and so that's why that becomes the variety that's dominant throughout Latin America.
That's so fascinating, because when we started talking about retracted S some years ago, at that time it wasn't totally clear, like, well, why does Latin, because the simple explanation for why Latin and ancient Greek must have a retracted S sound, and we can be sure about that as we can be sure about anything about the ancient phonology. Why we're sure about it is because, well, they don't have a sh sound, but that explanation, which is normally what I give the videos, is a little simplistic because it ignores the fact that, well, we have millions of Latin American native Spanish speakers who aren't following the same pattern of their European counterparts. Why? And it's because of a developmental difference. There existed the different varieties of sibilants in older forms of Spanish, whereas in Icelandic and modern Greek, in the whole history, if you go like from standard modern Greek all the way to the Proto-European, from Icelandic all the way back to Proto-European, and I think Dutch as well.
Dutch as well.
Dutch as well, that school, all the way back to Proto-European. There's never been more than just one sibilant in that particular track, which has led to the current standardized version of the language. And that's why Latin American Spanish is rather unusual for having a fronted laminal s, but no sh.
Right, exactly. So this Spanish is the perfect illustration of Spanish and Basque are the perfect illustrations of this sort of trajectory of development. But this actually seems to have been the case in huge swaths of Europe. So first of all of Iberia had this system of 3 sibilants. And in fact, while Portuguese has done its own developments to get rid of them, Mirandés, which is a language that's spoken on the border of Portugal and Spain, has 6 distinct sounds. S, z, z, sh, sh, right? So it retains that same incredible distinction of sibilants that is in Basque, although it also has voiced and unvoiced versions.
Ooh, there's 6.
And it's a Romance language. Yeah, there's 6.
Wow.
It's wonderful. And Mirandés is a Romance language, but it's a very small Romance language spoken almost exclusively by native speakers. And so that's how this kind of somewhat unstable system gets maintained over long periods of time. Meanwhile, it seems that medieval French and medieval German and a bunch of other medieval European languages had a very similar system. So for instance, German develops affricates like, in English we have water with a T, water, whereas in German it's
Wasser.
Wasser, right. So just like in Spanish, we had a shift of da to sa to sa, and then later on the sibilants merge. But historically it seems that German, just like a lot of these other European languages, inherited S as this retracted S sound from Proto-Germanic, but then it underwent these other developments as it developed additional sibilants. French seems to have been the same way, and we also see some evidence of this in Neapolitan in Italy. So for instance, if you've ever been to Napoli, you might hear instead of someone saying scusa, like excuse me, you might hear someone say scuse, right? Scuse. So S has become a sh before a consonant. This also happens in German, right?
Yep. Yeah, like stark.
Stark. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So this makes a lot more sense if you consider that historically the S sound was retracted, and then it's a very small shift to become a sh before these consonants, but then it fronts in all the other contexts, and that's how you have a very fronted S in all these other contexts, but then you have a sh before a consonant.
What's the other? So it voice, right? Did we talk about that? At least in the case of German. So we have the regular, written as a letter S, becomes voiced, right? Intervocalically and initial. It's devoiced at the end, like every other consonant in German. Okay, I'm pretty sure every final consonant in German is normally devoiced if it's possible phonotactically, right? So including like was, what am I doing? Was, which is what? Was, but so, which is so, or sehr, which is very, sehr. So that's what's going on. It's kind of, I guess, is that a form of, that's a voicing, is that lenition?
It's lenition.
It's lenition, it's voicing. Okay, and so the older German, like English, water is pronounced differently, is very close to the ancient word, it would be water, or something, water.
And Proto-Germanic it was water.
Yeah, and in Dutch it sounds pretty similar too, I think, to that. But then German has is it an intervocalic T that, I guess not necessarily.
Intervocalic T.
And finally like Herz.
And so T in general will often go to tsa.
Right.
And then intervocalically it goes from tsa to just sa.
So it was
Sa.
Watser and became Wasser, and then the frigatization of the Wasser in 19th century.
we've already given a lot of examples of the evidence for the sound, be it in going all the way back to Proto-Indo-European or just in the context of Latin and ancient Greek. But there's one additional piece of evidence to really hammer home how certain we are about this, which is the phenomenon of Rhoticisation.
Woo! What's that?
What's that?
Well, Rho. Yeah. I would put an Anson Rome meme in here, but I think only about 12 people who watched my video on Rho understood it. But they did. They kept it, why are you putting Anson Rome? Oh. Well, there's different kinds of Rhoticization. We have Greek, usually when we speak about these things, we use Greek names of letters, because why not? Ioticisation, or ioticism, would be how it could be any language, but in Greek, especially in particular, modern Greek, as it descends from ancient Greek, demonstrates how many vowels like epsilon iota, which in the ancient language was e, becomes e. It sounds like iota. And Greeks, I know you think when I say iota, it's wrong, but it's not, because that's the standard pronunciation of it in English. Please get over it. Thank you. Now, so iota, I know how it's pronounced in modern Greek. Thank you. So iota, it sounds like e. So epsilon iota becomes e. Eta becomes e. What else? It goes from a to e. What else? Omicron iota, omicron iota, goes from oi, e. And is that all of them? It's another one.
Yes. But none of those are examples of Rhoticism.
No, but these are the examples of what these Greek letters are. These are important. There's lambdacism, because they can happen in different languages. Lambdacism, the switching of an R and an L, like el coroseo instead of il coroseo.
In Roman dialect.
Right. And so lambdacism or rhoticization, where you switch from an L to an R, because it's like a lambda, a la, or ro, an R sound. So rhoticism could take many forms. It just means something's happening that is involving a ra sound.
Exactly. It's becoming a ra sound.
But
and so
going from retracted S to a rho.
Sibilants. Right. So we see sibilants becoming a ra sound. And we have several instances of this in Indo-European languages. So basically what tends to happen is that first you have a sibilant like s, and then it becomes voiced, z, and then z tends to either retract further to something like z, which is a retroflex sibilant, and then it becomes a trill, or it just goes straight from z to r.
Or I guess single, right? It wouldn't be geminated.
Yeah, so I'm just giving the...
Right, so you can hear it clearly.
And so this sort of shift seems to happen especially in instances where we have a retracted S. So we can give two very clear examples of this. One modern, one ancient, and then in Latin as well, of course, this occurs. Well, so first of all, why don't you give an example from Latin?
Okay, so honos, which is honor, honos, the older form of the genitive, honosis, that's how it's spelled, but almost certainly the pronunciation would have been, if it's the word that leads into to honoris, honor, would have to be honosis, everything's retracted, honosis, and the intervocalic one is voiced. So the za ends up becoming ra, honoris, and those are closer together. And because they're closer together, the retracted S is closer to a ra sound. That's a very important piece of evidence.
So this is a process that happened in pre-classical Latin. This rhoticization of what had been a voicing of the S sound. And we also see this happen in the Germanic languages. So this happened at one point in English. That's why we have alternations like was, were, in the past tense of the verb to be. But a really clear example of this would be Old Norse, right?
Yeah.
So for instance, the word wolf again, in Old Norse is ulver. Ulver. In modern Icelandic it's ulver, so almost identical. There's a little vowel inserted. Ulver. And this comes from Proto-Germanic wulfaz.
Wulfaz.
And those endings, the az endings, those are actually attested in inscriptions. So we have very, very early Germanic inscriptions where we have this az ending that's actually written down.
And the az ending is similar to the os ending of Greek in Latin.
Us in Latin. It's the exact same masculine nominative singular ending. And so az, we actually see in the inscriptions becomes probably z, so az becomes z and then z and then r by late Old Norse, and then of course into modern Icelandic we have ulfur. And that is directly cognate to os in Greek and us in Latin.
Right. And it's easier for this to happen if it's retracted.
Exactly.
So if it's not retracted.
And we know, looking at modern Icelandic, that we have this retracted S attested through the various historical stages of the language.
Well,
and then
please.
The final example of this that cannot be denied at all because it's literally happening now is actually, to return to one of our favorite languages to mention, Mores is Sardinian.
Woo!
So in Sardinian, the house is sadum.
Sadum.
So sa is from ipsa. Sadum, the house. And if you want to say the houses, it's sas domus. But when you stick those together, sas becomes sar. So instead of sas domus, you say sardomus.
Is that because the D is voiced?
Exactly. So it's only before a voiced sound.
Just like the honosis.
Exactly, just like honosis. So the voiced D turns sas into what would have been at one point saz, and then saz becomes sar. So sardomus.
Sardomus.
And we see the retracted S in Sardinian. We see that this is an active alternation between s and r.
Wow.
That's it's based on phonological context.
That's such an important thing, because that's why a really important point that you've made in other videos that we've done recently too. Pronunciation is too often thought of like, some you get or you don't. It's not taught properly. Vocabulary is taught, grammar is taught, and among those, idiom is thought to be a mix of the two. That is idiomatic, normal expressions and so forth. But pronunciation is way too often left out. And the science of understanding it is vital because it has an impact on the grammar. Of course, we're seeing something like the transformation of you can only have ulfur in Icelandic and in Old Norse because of the retracted S, which is inherently a part of the ancient version of the language, and thus also the same pronunciation of Latin and ancient Greek. Necessarily, it has to be retracted. Maybe we don't get it every time, maybe we decide not to do it, but to think it's just not important or not part of the language is incorrect. Right. It must be to make all of these other things happen.
Exactly.
And then, not only is it just as much as we know that the trilled r sound is a part of Latin, it's part of ancient Greek, as it is in the modern languages that are descended from it. Those are, you can ignore them, sure, but then you don't have to do it, even perhaps to be understood. But it's still, that is a part of the language. If you can't do it, we're not blaming anybody for not achieving some kind of foreign pronunciation. But to deny its existence is silly. But people just don't know about it. And then the other part that you make so often is that grammar is affected by pronunciation. So these two things, which I think are so important, this is why I'm so interested in pronunciation, and why you are too, I think. But because pronunciation is so inherently tied to every aspect of language, and how it affects the grammar, and then what it does to then change the language. Because especially when we're dealing with even ancient languages, we're seeing them in transition, much like modern languages. So if we understand an aspect of pronunciation which is regional to a modern language or typical of an ancient speaker, we're understanding something that could be really important in the literature or in the spoken language that we're trying to learn. So there's no reason not to, if we have the time, to at least watch a YouTube video or two to learn a little bit about the phonology and explore it more deeply.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So anything else?
No.
Did we cover retracted S in its entirety? All right. Cool. Well, leave comments. Raph is an outstanding teacher of pronunciation, phonology, Italian, Latin, and English. Spanish, wait, that was the other one, sorry. Anyway, and you can, if you want lessons with him, the information's in the description. Also, I'll link our live stream where we talked in more detail about, well, actually less, maybe was it more, we talked about a whole bunch of things for a couple hours. Yeah. Definitely, if you want lessons with a person who's been just, not only a great friend and colleague, but a teacher to me for years, this is the guy to do it with. And also, he has a YouTube channel, Paleogloss, which you should subscribe to. I've lost my sibilants. You should. She sells seashells by the seashore. That's why that's typical, right? Because they're sibilants. Yeah. Subscribe to his channel as well. And Raph, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Gracias por
Valete.